Chapter 9, Part 1 of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 9, Elisha Kent Kane, Arctic Explorer, Part 1. Among the picturesque and striking figures of Arctic explorers, none abides more firmly in the minds of Americans than that of Elisha Kent Kane, whose career and fame largely relate to the fate of the lost explorer, Sir John Franklin. Kane was born in Philadelphia, February 3, 1820. In 1842 he graduated in medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and the following year, while waiting for a vacancy in the Medical Corps of the Navy, for which he had passed an examination, sailed on the frigate Brandywine, as physician to the embassy, to China, under Caleb Cushing, Minister Plenipotentiary. Later, commissioned as an officer of the Medical Corps of the United States Navy, he served on the west coast of Africa, in Brazil, in the Mediterranean, and on special duty with the Army in Mexico. This brief statement of his duties conveys, however, no idea of the intense energy and restless activity of Kane in his eager efforts to acquire personal knowledge of the very ends of the earth. Indeed, considering Kane's very short life, he died at 37, there is no man of modern times to whom the words of Tennyson, in his strong poem of Ulysses, more fittingly apply. I cannot rest from travel, for always roaming with a hungry heart much have I seen and known, cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments, myself not least but honored of them all. Suffice it here to say that before Kane was 30 he had visited in America the greater part of the eastern half of the United States, the city of Mexico, Cuba, and Brazil from Rio de Janeiro to the eastern Andes, in Africa along the gold and slave coasts to Dahomey, Cape Colony, and up the Nile to the Second Cataract, in Europe the eastern, southern, and central countries, in Asia the coast of China, Ceylon, India, from Bombay to the Himalayas, Persia, and Syria. Elsewhere he had traveled in the islands of Cape Verde, Singapore, Java, Sumatra, and Luzon of the Philippines. This incessant travel is the more remarkable as he was always seasick, was a man of delicate physique, and nowhere passed 6 months without being prostrated by severe illness. As to personal experiences, he had been wounded in Egypt by a Bedouin who strove to rob him, narrowly escaped death in saving captured Mexican officers from slaughter at the hands of renegade irregulars, and barely survived his unique experiences in the crater of a volcano. His descent into the volcano of Tael, in the Philippines, illustrates Kane's utter disregard of dangers whenever he desired to investigate any phenomena. As related by Dr. Elder, Kane not only was lowered 200 feet below the point usually visited, but descended to the very surface of the burning lake, and dipped his specimen bottles into the steaming sulphur water. This feat nearly cost him his life, for although he was able to crawl to and fasten the bamboo ropes around his body, yet his boots were charred in pieces on his feet, sulphurous air currents stifled him into insensibility, and he would have perished had it not been for the strenuous exertions of Baron Low, his companion. The turning point in Kane's life came in 1850, when, induced by the persistent petition of Lady Franklin, President Taylor recommended to Congress an appropriation for an expedition in search of Sir John Franklin and his missing ships. Kane immediately volunteered for Arctic service, pressing and urging his application by every means at his command. Congress acted tardily, so that the whole expedition was fitted out in 18 days, and Kane, at the last moment, when his hopes had failed, received orders as surgeon of the Advance, the flagship which he joined May 20, 1850. The expedition owed its existence to the enterprise and generosity of Henry Grinnell, whose philanthropic mind planned, practical energy equipped, and munificence endowed it. Without Grinnell's action, Congress would have failed to fit out the expedition, and the grateful chapter of American co-operation with England in its Franklin search would have been unwritten. Such practical displays of sympathy in matters of general and national interest, now considered the most hopeful signs of international fellowship, may be said to have been inaugurated by the dispatch of the first Grinnell expedition on its errand of humanity. Under a joint resolution of Congress, passed May 2, 1850, the President was authorized to accept and attach to the Navy 2 vessels offered by Henry Grinnell, Esquire, to be sent to the Arctic seas in search of Sir John Franklin and his companions. These vessels, 2 very small brigs, the flagship Advance and the Rescue, were placed under command of Lieutenant Edwin J. De Haven, an officer of Antarctic service under Wilkes. The vessels had detachable rudders, modern fittings, were admirably strengthened, and fully equipped. In short, they were thoroughly adapted to the difficult navigation in prospect. Where Grinnell's forethought and liberality ended, there was, says Kane, another tale. The strictly naval equipment could not be praised, and the crews consisted of man-of-war's men of various climes and habitudes, with constitutions most of them impaired by disease or temporarily broken by the excesses of shore life. But he commends them as ever brave, willing, and reliable. The squadron touched at various Greenland ports, and then entered the dreaded ice pack of Melville Bay, in which the sailing vessels made slow progress. But in their besetment of 3 weeks the only dangerous experience was a nip, which nearly destroyed the Advance. The movement of the ice floes is thus graphically told by Kane. The momentum of the assailing floe was so irresistible that, as it impinged against the solid margin of the land, ice there was no recoil, no interruption to its progress. The elastic material corrugated before the enormous pressure, then cracked, then crumbled, and at last rose, the lesser over the greater, sliding up in great inclined planes, and these again breaking by their weight and their continued impulse, toppled over in long lines of fragmentary ice. De Haven entered Lancaster Sound near the end of August, in company with half a dozen English ships bound on the same humane errand, and on the 24th Master Griffin, of the Rescue, participated in the search with Captain Ommaney, which resulted in the discovery, on Beechy Island, of vestiges of an encampment. 2 days later De Haven and Kane shared in the joint search, wherein Captain Penny discovered the graves of 3 of Franklin's crew. These discoveries proved that Franklin's expedition had wintered there during 1845–46, and later innumerable traces of their stay were noted, indicating the good condition and activity of the expedition. On September 10th De Haven's squadron was off Griffith Island in company with 8 English search ships. Consulting with Griffin, De Haven concluded that they had not attained such a position as promised advantageous operations in the season of 1851, and so decided to extricate the vessels from the ice and return home. Strong gales and an unusually early advance of winter prevented such action, and resulted in the ships being frozen up in the pack, where they drifted helplessly to and fro, a condition they were destined to undergo for many months. Beset in the middle of Wellington Channel, the American squadron, with varying movements to and fro, first drifted under the influence of southerly gales to the north-northwest, attaining latitude 75° 25' north, longitude 93° 31' west. In this northerly drift the expedition discovered Mardog Island, and quite extensive masses of land to the northwest of North Devon, to which the name of Grinnell was given. This land was further extended the following year by the discoveries of Captain Penny, and most unwarrantable efforts were made by ungenerous and unappreciating officials in England to take from the American squadron its ewe lamb of 1850, an attempt that, properly refuted, failed of its purpose. October 2, 1860, the direction of the drift changed to the south, and later to the east. Their involuntary course lay through Wellington Channel, Barrow Strait, and Lancaster Sound into Baffin Bay, where release came, near Cape Walsingham, June 5, 1851. The drift covered 1,050 miles, and lasted 8½ months. The sun was absent 12 weeks. It is impossible to adequately describe the physical and mental sufferings of the party during this protracted ice imprisonment. It was a constant succession of harassing conditions, each, if possible, seeming worse than the former. Now the ships were so firmly embedded in the cemented ice pack that extrication appeared impossible. Again, the complete disruption of the pack threatened, or the instant destruction of their vessels impended, with prospects of a winter on the naked floe under such conditions of darkness, sickness, lack of shelter, and suitable nutrition as would render a lingering death unavoidable. No single week passed with a feeling of security. For days at a time there was no hour free from terrible suspense as to what fate might immediately befall, and 4 times in one day the entire party prepared to abandon ship at order. The cold became extreme, the mean of 1 week in March being 31 degrees below zero. Seal and other fresh meat could be got only in small quantities, and scurvy, the bane of Arctic explorers, affected all save 6 of the crew, DeHaven being put off duty by this disease. In all these terrible experiences, which were borne with a fortitude, courage, and patience most creditable, Kane was first and foremost in sustaining the heroic efforts of Griffin, master of the rescue, on whom the executive duties devolved during DeHaven's illness. It may be said that not only Kane's medical skill, but also his cheeriness, activity, and ingenious devices contributed largely to conserve the health, spirits, and morale of the crew in these dark hours when despair seemed justified. Released from the pack, DeHaven patched up his injured ships and attempted to return and prosecute further the Franklin search. But, stopped in his return journey by ice in the upper part of Melville Bay, he judiciously decided to return to the United States, which was safely reached September 30th, 1851. The following extracts from Kane's very vivid account of the expedition illustrate some of the most striking phases of their experiences as recorded in his journal. Of the conditions and experience of the Advance in the moving ice pack, he says: "We were yet to be familiarized with the strife of the ice tables, now broken into tumbling masses, and piling themselves in angry confusion against our sides, now fixed in chaotic disarray by the fields of new ice that embedded them in a single night, again, perhaps, opening in treacherous pools, only to close around us with a force that threatened to grind our brig to powder. A level, snow-covered surface was rising up in inclined planes or rudely undulating curves. These, breaking at their summits, fell off on each side in masses of 20 tons weight, tables of 6 feet in thickness by 20 of perpendicular height, and some of them 15 yards in length, surging up into the misty air, heaving, rolling, tottering, and falling with a majestic deliberation worthy of the forces that impelled them." The following descriptions indicate the narrow escapes of the ships from destruction during disruptions of the ice pack. The separated sides would come together with an explosion, like a mortar, crouching at the newly formed field and driving it headlong in fragments for 50 feet upon the floe till it piled up against our bulwarks. Everything betokened a crisis. Sledges, boats, packages of all sorts were disposed in order. Contingencies were met as they approached by new delegation of duty. Every man was at work, officers and seamen alike. The rescue, crippled and thrown away from us to the further side of a chasm, was deserted, and her company consolidated with ours. Our own brig groaned and quivered under the pressure against her sides. The ice came in with the momentum before mentioned as irresistible, progressive, and grand. All expected to betake ourselves sledgeless to the ice, for the open space around the vessel barely admits of a footboard. The timbers and even crossbeams protected by shores vibrated so as to communicate to you the peculiar tremor of a cotton factory. Presently the stern of the brig, by a succession of jerking leaps, began to rise, while her bows dipped toward the last night's ice ahead. Everybody looked to see her fall upon her beam ends and crushed out upon the ice. On the 13th the hummock ridge astern advanced with a steady march upon the vessel. Twice it rested and advanced again, a dense wall of ice, 30 feet broad at the base and 12 feet high, tumbling huge fragments from its crest, yet increasing in mass at every new effort. We had ceased to hope, when a merciful interposition arrested it so close against our counter that there was scarcely room for a man to pass between. Half a minute of progress more, and it would have buried us all. As we drifted along 5 months afterward, this stupendous memento of controlling power was still hanging over our stern. The discomfort of the prescribed out-of-door exercise in extreme cold appears from the following. Close the lips for the first minute or two, and admit the air suspiciously through nostril and mustache. Presently you breathe in a dry, pungent, but gracious and agreeable atmosphere. The beard, eyebrows, eyelashes, and the downy pubescence of the ears acquire a delicate white and perfectly enveloped cover of venerable hoarfrost. The mustache and underlip form pendulous beads of dangling ice. Put out your tongue and it instantly freezes to this icy crusting, and a rapid effort and some hand aid will be required to liberate it. The less you talk, the better. Your chin has a trick of freezing to your upper jaw by the luting aid of your beard. Even my eyes have often been so glued as to show that even a wink may be unsafe. The unfortunate physical condition of the party made Kane's duties most onerous and wearing. In midwinter, he says, scurvy advanced steadily. This fearful disease, so often warded off when in a direct attack, now exhibited itself in a cachexy, a depraved condition of system sad to encounter. Pains, diffuse and non-locatable, were combined with an apathy and lassitude which resisted all attempts at healthy excitement. These, of course, were not confined to the crew alone. Out of 24 men but 5 were without ulcerated gums and blotched limbs. All the officers were assailed. The expedition safe in port, the recollection of the horrors and privations of his midwinter drift through the polar pack did not deter Kane from again braving the danger of Arctic exploration, and he was soon busily engaged in stimulating public opinion to the support of another expedition. To this end he especially addressed the American Geographic Society, of which Henry Grinnell was president, presenting a well-intended but fallacious and illogical plan for continuing the search for Franklin. Kane was personally aware, from the experiences of his previous voyage with De Haven, that Franklin had wintered at Beechy Island, in 74 degrees 43 minutes north, 91 degrees 33 minutes west, and that his positive orders from the Admiralty required him to push southward from the vicinity of Cape Walker to Bering Strait. A search for him by the way of Smith Sound, 4 degrees of latitude to the northward and 17 degrees of longitude to the eastward of his last known position, rested on the violent assumption that Franklin had not only directly disobeyed his positive orders to go west and southwest, but had done so after 1/3 of the distance from Greenland to Bering Strait had been accomplished. Again, there had lately been made public in England the last direct report from the Franklin expedition, a letter from Captain Fitzjames, who relates that Franklin showed him part of his instructions, expressed his disbelief in an open sea to the north, and gave a pleasant account of his expectations of being able to get through the ice on the coast of America. Dr. Rae had also reported finding drift material on the north coast of America, which, having the broad arrow and red thread of the government, could come from the quarter where Franklin's orders sent him, thus confirming the belief that he had gone southwest from Cape Walker. Moreover, the squadrons of Belcher and Collinson were actively engaged in the search northward of America. It was finally decided that a second expedition should be sent, the United States cooperating, as before, with private enterprise, and to the command of this expedition Kane was assigned, by orders from the Secretary of the Navy, in November, 1852. The expedition was fitted out through the liberality of 2 Americans, Henry Grinnell, who again placed the brig Advance at the disposal of the government, and George Peabody, the American philanthropist, who contributed $10,000, a sum that practically covered all other expenses of the voyage. Kane's faith in the existence of an open polar sea and his intention of reaching it were clearly asserted. Combined with the proposed search for Franklin was a declared purpose to extend northward the discoveries of Inglefield in 1851 on the west coast of Greenland, where, as Kane says, he contemplated reaching its most northern attainable point, and thence pressing on toward the Pole as far as boats or sledges could carry us, examine the coastlines for vestiges of the lost party. The expedition sailed from New York May 30, 1853, consisting of 18 men, all volunteers, although 10 belonged to the United States Navy. Except as regards scientific instruments, the equipment of the expedition was in most respects inadequate and unsuitable for Arctic service, the bulk of the provisions, for instance, being hard bread, salt beef, and pork, with no canned meats or vegetables. The Greenland ports were visited, where a moderate amount of fur clothing and 50 Eskimo dogs were purchased. On June 27th the Advance entered Melville Bay, and standing boldly to the westward, although hindered by the loose drifting ice, was favored by an offshore gale, and in 10 days passed into the open sea west of Cape York, known to Arctic voyagers as the North Water, the only misfortune being the loss of a whaleboat. In order to secure retreat, Kane, fortunately for himself as it afterward proved, cached his metallic lifeboat, filled with boat stores, on Littleton Island. Favored by the conditions of the ice, Kane rounded Cape Hatherton, when the main pack setting southward obliged him to seek shelter in Refuge Harbor, a landlocked cove. Later the Advance was able, as the ice opened, to make sail and pass around Cairn Point, but a violent gale broke her from her moorings and nearly wrecked her. The ice conditions were now so adverse that 7 of his 8 officers addressed to him written opinions in favor of a return to a more southern harbor. Such retrograde movement would have removed them from the contemplated field of operations, and Kane declined. Every favorable opportunity of warping the brig she could be moved in no other way was availed of, and despite most difficult conditions of ice and water, the brig being on her beam ends at low tide and jammed by floes at high water, she was moved a number of miles to the eastward, and on September 9th was put into winter quarters in Rensselaer Harbor, 78° 37' north, 71° 14' west, which, says Kane, we were fated never to leave together, a long resting place to her, for the same ice is around her still. End of Chapter 9, Part 1. Recording by William Tomco.